The Jerusalem Channel is made possible by viewer support. Thanks for watching.
At the United Nations headquarters in New York, it's fascinating to know that 15 countries flying their flags outside the building have a crescent symbol, and 25 nations feature a cross on their flag. But there's only one nation in the entire world that has the Shield of David, known as the Star of David, on its flag, and that's the tiny nation of Israel. But for some people, sadly, that's one nation too many. It's inconceivable and shocking to me that anti-Semitism has reared its ugly head within living memory of the Holocaust. So whatever happened to the world's promise, never again? Hello, I'm Christine Darg. The Bible says in Daniel 11:32 that the people who know God will be strong and carry out exploits. That means that we'll take action. And I encourage you to do exploits for God in prayer, in acts, in evangelism, and in standing up for biblical truth. The future of our freedom is at stake. And the defining battle of our times is over truth. There are approximately 100 nations in the world where Christianity has been or currently is the predominant religion. And there are some 56 Islamic states where Islam predominates. But today, a single Jewish state has become the pariah of the nations. This is terrible, inordinate discrimination and defamation. I remember as a child looking with horror at issues of Life magazine that showed heaps and heaps of dead, emaciated Jewish bodies at the Nazi concentration camps. And I hope you're as thoroughly shocked as I am that rampant anti-Semitism has returned within living memory of the Nazi Holocaust. In France, worshippers in a synagogue were surrounded by a howling mob claiming to protest Israeli policies. In Brussels, 4 people were murdered in the Jewish Museum, and a synagogue was firebombed. Even in Britain, Jewish families are uneasy as anti-Semitic incidences have spiraled. Many Jews are asking whether they even have a future in Europe. The terrorist organization Hamas is pinning high hopes on the BDS movement. BDS stands for Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions against Israel. And this is the latest tactic of anti-Semitism to pave the way for the destruction of Israel through boycotts, divestment, and sanctions. The BDS movement has the veneer of legality, but Hamas believes that these tools are just as important as rockets and suicide bombs in order to destroy Israel. So on whose side of history will you be? College campuses and universities that allow the BDS activists to disseminate their hate against Israel don't seem to be aware that they are serving as ambassadors of Hamas. Plans are underway for the BDS campaign to intensify, to force democratic Israel to surrender and ultimately even to cease to exist. The anti-Israel activities of the BDS movement serve to embolden the terrorists. But the BDS movement also undermines genuine peace-loving Palestinians who want to coexist with Israel. If BDS supporters really cared about Palestinians, they would promote reforms, democracy, freedom of speech and religion, and the rights of women who live under the tyranny of terrorist groups like Hamas and Hezbollah. The actual fruit of the BDS movement is to promote Hamas's agenda of hate and destruction of Jews, rather than advancing the cause of peace. In a recent interview, a Palestinian human rights activist who really isn't a big lover of Israel, said he's very opposed to BDS because, as he said, this really only hurts the Palestinians themselves. Also, he clearly stated that Israel is not an apartheid state. Now, as Britain's former chief rabbi, Lord Jonathan Sacks, points out, the politics of hate that begins with Jews never ends with Jews. It wasn't Jews alone, after all, who suffered under Hitler and Stalin. And it's hardly Jews alone who are suffering today under Hitler's successors. And that's the radical Islamists of Hamas, Hezbollah, Al-Qaeda, Boko Haram, and the Islamic State terrorists and so forth. The global assault on Jews and the Jewish state is part of a sinister trend that includes attacks on Christians and other minority faiths. Jihad's so-called holy war is a political and religious equivalent of ethnic cleansing. And ultimately, the new anti-Semitism and the boycott movement against Israel are an assault on democratic and religious freedoms as a whole. Europe will be pushed back into the dark ages if the new and deadly anti-Semitism is not quickly stopped. Today's anti-Semitism differs from the old anti-Semitism. As Lord Sacks said so well, in the Middle Ages, Jews were hated for their religion. In the 19th and 20th centuries, Jews were despised for their race. But today, Jews are hated because of their nation state of Israel. In a word, Israel is the only country among the 193 members of the United Nations whose right to exist is routinely challenged. Now, we've carefully said over and over on this program, and it bears repeating here, that not all criticism of Israel is, in fact, anti-Semitic. You see, nobody at times is more critical of Israel than Israelis and Israeli politicians. But in this program, we must examine the inordinate hatred that is growing once again against the Jews and against the one and only Jewish state. You see, for 1,000 years, the Jewish people were the most conspicuous non-Christian presence in Europe. But today, they are the most conspicuous non-Islamic presence in the Middle East. Now, human rights for everybody do matter, but it's the sheer disproportion of accusations against Israel that makes Jews feel that humanitarian concern isn't the prime motivation in the number of accusations coming against them. You see, more than half of all critical resolutions adopted by the UN Human Rights Council have been directed against the tiny country of Israel. And according to the organization called UN Watch, in the year 2013, the UN General Assembly adopted 21 resolutions singling out Israel for censure. And there were only 4 resolutions to protest against other countries. Hatred of Jews, known as anti-Semitism, is the oldest form of hatred, let's face it, in the world today. Recently, we attended the annual Jerusalem Post conference in New York City, and senior contributing editor Caroline Glick remarked there that anti-Semitism has tragically become so common that it's no longer considered a social stigma in many circles to be anti-Semitic. That's so hard for me to believe. But hatred of Jews is one of the most troubling end-time signs. And so it's incumbent upon all Bible believers to be sure that we're kept undefiled from the curse of anti-Semitism. And it is a curse, according to the Bible in Genesis 12:3 and elsewhere. Hatred of God's ancient people brings God's curse both upon individuals and upon entire nations. Well, at that conference, there was a panel discussion on this gathering storm, and one of the most riveting speakers was a Canadian parliamentarian and cabinet member, Irwin Cotler, who chairs a coalition for combating anti-Semitism. And as Canada's Minister of Justice, he developed the National Justice Initiative Against Racism and Hate. So he knows what he's talking about. Irwin Cotler has insights on the subject that I'd never heard anyone else share. And so I want to relate as best as I can some of the things that he told us. It's important that we become well informed to advocate against the oldest hatred in the world. Irwin Cotler participated in the first ever UN General Assembly Forum on Global Anti-Semitism, which took place at a critical time on the eve of the 70th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz, which was, of course, the most brutal extermination camp of the 20th century. Auschwitz was the center of horrors, too terrible to be believed, but not too terrible to have happened. Although Irwin Cotler participated in a UN forum on anti-Semitism, nevertheless, the UN today is one of the biggest perpetrators of anti-Semitism. And part of the deception of the last days is that the UN regularly incites hatred and bigotry against the Jewish state, and then turns around and holds a global forum on anti-Semitism. In fact, the new wave of anti-Semitism was intensified by the UN in the summer of 2001 at the UN's Conference Against Racism in Durban, South Africa. At that conference, Israel was accused of 5 cardinal sins against human rights: racism, apartheid, crimes against humanity, ethnic cleansing, and attempted genocide. But even earlier than that, in the year 1975, the UN General Assembly adopted a resolution that slandered the biblical movement of Zionism. We have to understand that Zionism is the God-driven desire of Jews to return to their biblical homeland as prophesied in the Bible. But the Durban Conference adopted a resolution that equated biblical Zionism with racism. Therefore, the UN Conference Against Racism turned out to be, in fact, against God's end-time purposes. Now, in his response to the Durban resolution, Israel's UN ambassador at the time, Chaim Herzog, noted the irony of the resolution's timing. The vote came exactly 37 years after the Kristallnacht pogrom in Germany that led up to the Holocaust of European Jews. And the late U.S. Senator Daniel Moynihan said that the UN's resolution against Zionism gave the abomination of anti-Semitism the appearance of international legal sanction. That's such an important quote, I need to repeat it. The UN's resolution against Zionism gave the abomination of anti-Semitism the appearance of international legal sanction. Wow, that's really difficult. And so we're witnessing a more sophisticated, global, lethal anti-Semitism. What's currently going on is without parallel since the atmosphere of the 1930s. The new anti-Jewishness overlaps with classical anti-Semitism, but is also different and more deceptive because it's being sanctioned as legal. Can you see that? So according to Irwin Cotler, the new anti-Semitism almost needs a new vocabulary to define it. However, it can be identified from the perspective of anti-discrimination laws, equality rights, and international law. Classical anti-Semitism is the discrimination against or assault upon the rights of Jews as people to live as equal members of society. But the new anti-Semitism goes much further and involves the discrimination against or the assault upon the right of the Jewish people to live as an equal member of the family of nations. Called into question is their very right to live at all as a people, with Israel emerging as the targeted collective Jew amongst the nations. The primary target of the new anti-Semitism is the collective Jew, the state of Israel. But such attacks start a chain reaction and bring on assaults against individual Jews and Jewish institutions. In the past, the most dangerous anti-Semites wanted to make the world Judenrein, free of Jews. And today, the most dangerous anti-Semites want to make the world free of a Jewish state. Think about that. While in his talk at the Jerusalem Post Conference, Erwin Kotler outlined 4 indicators of pandemic anti-Semitism. He said the first indicator of the new anti-Semitism, and the most lethal, is what he defined as genocidal anti-Semitism. This genocidal anti-Semitism can be seen in state-sanctioned incitement to genocide of Israel by leaders in Iran. All the time, unbelievably, the Iranian leaders declare they're on a divine mission to annihilate the Jewish state. And who rebukes them? Genocidal anti-Semitism is also seen in the charters of terrorist organizations, namely the Iranian-backed terrorist groups Hamas and Hezbollah. How many people in the West know that the Hamas Charter calls for the destruction of Israel and the killing of Jews everywhere? And the Hamas Charter calls for continual acts of terror to kill Jews. And yet, naive Western politicians demand that Israel negotiate with these genocidal criminals. What is even less well known is that the Hamas Charter is filled with anti-Semitic historical lies and blood libels, that the Jews are responsible for all the wars and the evils in this world. Genocidal anti-Semitism also drives the Islamic religious fatwas. Fatwas are execution orders, where mosques and Muslim media make it a religious duty to commit genocide of Jews. Jews in Judaism are characterized as enemies of Islam, and therefore the Jewish state of Israel has become the Salman Rushdie of the nations. Any professing Christian who considers, therefore, affiliating with the BDS movement should take a long, hard look at the Hamas Charter and at the hate-filled demonstrations in Europe, which have been replete with genocidal chants to send Jews to the gas chambers. So whose side of history do you really want to be on? Despicable and shameful demonstrations in Europe have been accompanied by the firebombing of 8 synagogues in France in 1 month alone. Attacks on Jewish community centers and on innocent people in places simply identifiable as Jewish. Genocidal anti-Semitism has caused the president of Germany's Central Council of Jews to despair that we've entered the worst times since the Nazi era. Because on the streets in Germany, of all places, you can hear shocking screams like the Jews should be gassed and the Jews should be burned. So we've come to this. Israel is the only state in the world, and the Jewish people are the only people in the world who are the objects of standing threats by governmental, terrorist, and radical religious groups. Think about that. What an onslaught. Erwin Kotler said that the second indicator of the new anti-Semitism is the globalizing indictment of Israel and the Jewish people as the embodiment of all evil, with charges of racism, imperialism, colonialism, ethnic cleansing, apartheid, and even Nazism. The moment a nation is labeled with the stigma of apartheid, it's instantly equated with evil, whether or not the charges are actually true. And so this is called political terrorism against Israel. And as one who lives part-time in Israel, I can tell you that Jews and Arabs shop together. They eat in the same restaurants. Christian Arabs serve in the army if they want to. Arabs, Bedouin, and Druze elect members to the Israeli parliament, and so forth. In fact, a British Muslim Jew hater who visited Israel was so shocked to see firsthand the freedoms that Arabs actually have in Israel compared to the rest of the Middle East that he became a Muslim Zionist, and he has a page on Facebook. Now, Erwin Kotler's third indicator of the dangerous times that we're passing through is political anti-Semitism, political terrorism. And this is the denial of the fundamental rights to the Jewish people and only to the Jewish people. In other words, if genocidal anti-Semitism is a public call for the destruction of Israel, then political anti-Semitism is the denial of Israel's right to exist, the denial of its legitimacy, and the denial of the Jewish people's right to self-determination. This political anti-Semitism constitutes, as Dr. Martin Luther King once observed, the denial to the Jews of the same right to self-determination that we accord to African nations and to all other peoples around the globe. Well, the fourth manifestation of anti-Semitism that we're witnessing ought to be of particular concern to the United Nations and to anybody who cares about human rights and international law. Erwin Kotler calls it the laundering or masking of anti-Semitism under universal public values and human rights. This is just pernicious and prejudicial. The singling out of one member state for discriminatory treatment is a contradiction of the UN Charter, which grants equality of all nations, large and small. And at the same time, the discrimination against Israel turns a blind eye to rogue states that are major human rights violators, like, for example, North Korea. But as Erwin Kotler rightly pointed out, this laundering of anti-Semitism erodes the integrity of the UN and diminishes the authority of international law. It absolutely corrupts the culture of human rights and shames the real struggle against racism. In fact, as I said in the beginning of the program, the first intergovernmental conference to combat anti-Semitism was actually hosted by the United Nations in 2004. And the words of former Secretary General Kofi Annan at that conference are as relevant today as they were in 2004. Kofi Annan said that throughout history, anti-Semitism has been a unique manifestation of hatred, intolerance, and persecution. He said that anti-Semitism has flourished even in communities where Jews have never lived, and it has been a harbinger of discrimination against others. And so the rise of anti-Semitism anywhere is a threat to people everywhere. And in fighting anti-Semitism, we fight, Kofi Annan said, for the future of all humanity. Indeed, the United Nations came into being when the world had just learned the full horror of the Nazi concentration and extermination camps. And so Kofi Annan rightly said that the United Nations actually emerged from the ashes of the Holocaust. A human rights agenda that fails to address anti-Semitism denies its own history. Well, as I said at the beginning of this program, it's hard to believe that within living memory of the tragedy of the Holocaust, anti-Semitism is once again rearing its evil head. But it's clear that we're witnessing an alarming resurgence of this phenomenon in new forms and more devastating manifestations. This time, the church must not and cannot be silent. And you don't want to be on the wrong side of history. Zionism is the greatest moral issue of our generation. Israel has returned and is blessing the world with every kind of technological, agricultural, and medical wonder. So why should Israel's defense result in anti-Semitism? Each watchman on the walls of Jerusalem is on the front lines of this battle of political terror and collective anti-Semitism against the Jewish state. Believe me, Israel is fighting for its legitimacy in the family of nations every day. But in fighting anti-Semitism, we are fighting for the future of all humanity. The hatred of the Jews and the demonizing of the Jewish state is very disturbing to a person like me, because I was raised on the Bible from my baby crib, and my godly Christian parents taught me to reverence the Jewish people, who are, after all, our patriarchs in the faith. And they taught me to reverence all that the Jews have represented and continue to represent. After all, they are God's chosen people, and He's not finished with them. Every Christian owes a debt to the Jewish people for the Bible, and even Jesus Himself said in John 4:22 that salvation comes through the Jews. What Jesus meant by that statement is that without the conduit of the Jewish nation, we never would have had a Bible, a Savior, and no future millennial kingdom. And so that's why Satan himself is behind the new anti-Semitism, because the adversary knows the Jewish state must be in place as a platform for the second coming of Jesus the Messiah. The return of Jesus will signal the end of Satan's rule on this earth from behind the scenes. So Satan inspires terrorist groups and rogue states with wicked desires like Haman of old to destroy all the Jews. That's why I hate to see this new anti-Semitism. But I'm comforted by the miraculous recreation of the state of Israel despite all the ongoing anti-Semitism. And I'm comforted by the regathering of the Jewish exiles from the four corners of the earth. You see, Israel's very existence today is a fulfillment of this Word of God. And if the state of Israel is a fulfillment of Bible prophecy, then the God of Israel will keep, protect, guard, and defend His Word and the ongoing fulfillment of it. It doesn't matter what enemy or confederation of nations tries to destroy Israel, God will work miracle after miracle on behalf of His ancient people in order to vindicate His holy word. And so it's absolutely vital for you to understand that the pivotal nation of Israel is a physical sign of the favor and faithfulness of God. Unlike the United Nations, the God of Israel favors the return of His people at this time, at the culmination of history. And the Jewish people are, as the Apostle Paul taught in Romans 11, still beloved by God. And so let's choose to stand on the right side of history and stand in the gap as watchmen on the walls and plead with God to hasten the time that He will arise and scatter Israel's anti-Semitic, genocidal enemies. Well, if you'd like to watch this important teaching on anti-Semitism again, or if you'd like to watch other programs concerning Israel or divine healing or understanding the times prophetically, you can stay in contact with us through our social media, or you can visit our website daily at exploits.tv. We invite you to click online to receive a free copy of our color magazine, Exploits. Or our magazine also prints booklets, very timely booklets, such as this one, 40 Signs That Jesus Will Soon Return. And on our website, you can explore our archive of past videos, and you'll find daily news updates and commentaries about important events, as well as details of our upcoming prayer convocations. And so until next time, earnestly contending for the faith and reminding you to pray for the peace of Jerusalem, I'm Christine Darg. Shalom. Something prophetic, something biblical and surely significant is always happening here in the city of the great King, in Jerusalem, the worship capital of the world. We want to thank you for being a part of the Jerusalem Channel and for faithfully supporting it. It's because of your support that we're able to bring vital insights in these last days. And we especially want to remind you to receive your free copy of our Exploits Ministry magazine. You can receive it by going 24/7 to our website at exploits.tv. And in the United States, we have a toll-free number. Also in the UK, we have a telephone number so that you can send us your comments, which I always enjoy reading, and your prayer request. I want to pray for you here in the city of the great King. So please stay in touch with me via Twitter, Facebook, or our website. Blessing you from the city of the great King, I'm Christine Darg. Shalom.